Good day, everyone. On behalf of Eve Blau and myself, as well as the entire Graduate School of Design, I want to welcome you to today's public program, the Rachel Dorothy Tanur Memorial Lecture, which is being given by Dr. Andrea Roberts. We are so thrilled to be hosting this event. The title of Dr. Roberts' talk is The Community Core, Making and Keeping Place Heritage in Texas Freedom Colonies. I also mentioned my colleague Eve Blau at the outset, because she and I are the chairs of the Urban Planning and Design Speaker Series, and we see this talk as continuing in some ways the original conceptual thematic, which we initiated last year around the subject of small town urbanism. What we were trying to accomplish with that theme was to redirect the focus of planners and designers away from the preoccupation with large cities and metropolises and to examine other settlements and territorialities. In today's lecture, Dr. Roberts will be doing just that by focusing on smaller settlements in Texas that span the rural landscape. As you've seen already in the announcement about this lecture, one of Dr. Roberts' intentions here is to focus on what she has termed the rural vernacular African-American place-keeping strategies, an agenda that she argues has been understudied among scholars who focus on the transgressive expressions of Black liberation, who with that focus have tended to concentrate their efforts on large cities. Along the way, Dr. Roberts will address a range of other themes and concerns that align with so many other topics of engagement among our own faculty and students, including history, memory, and the acts of conservation and preservation, particularly those that serve as a basis for community building as a social enterprise and an agenda for the planning and urban design of place. Among the critical issues that have captured attention in Dr. Roberts' work are land retention, adaptive reuse, and the creation of what she calls free Black space, particularly in the face of such issues as displacement, gentrification, and resource extraction. With these works, Dr. Roberts has placed herself at the forefront of inquiry and scholarship on Black planning history, cultural landscape theory, Black feminist preservation, and participatory preservation. So we are so thrilled to have you with us, Dr. Roberts. Now, if I shared her entire bio, very impressive bio with you, we would not have time for a lecture. So I'm just going to give you a very truncated version. We can produce a longer version in the chat, but she is currently the director of the Texas Freedom Colonies Project, as well as an assistant professor of urban planning and co-founder of the African American Digital Humanities Working Group at Texas A&M University. She's a fellow with several of their centers, including those focused on hazard reduction, sustainable communities, and more. Dr. Roberts holds a PhD in community and regional planning from the University of Texas at Austin, where she also holds an MA in government administration from the University of Pennsylvania and a BA in political science from Vassar College. And she has years of experience in nonprofit management and multiple articles in major journals that are important to our constituencies, including Planning Theory, Journal of Planning History, Journal of Community Archaeology and Heritage, just to name a few. But before turning the podium over to Dr. Roberts, let me also say that we have an additional and welcome surprise today, which is that after her Tanur Memorial Lecture, Dr. Roberts will be joined by current Loeb Fellow Monica Rhodes, a fellow activist and scholar in the field of historic preservation, for a direct conversation between the two of them. And we're so happy that Monica was able to join us this year and that she at the GSD is a Loeb Fellow, but also in today's program. I guess that means that I feel like we have an embarrassment of intellectual riches with the involvement of these two amazing women in our program today. If you don't know already, Monica is the former director of research management at the National Park Foundation, where she oversaw facility and grant making to the National Park Service. And she also helped lead efforts to develop strategies for African American and Latinx engagement. Monica has her undergraduate degree in history from the University of Tulsa and a master's degree in African American studies from Temple. And she also attended the University of Pennsylvania, where she received a master's degree in historic preservation, excuse me. Rhodes, her work has worked on the Commission for Historical and Architectural Preservation and the Market Center Community Development Corporation Board in Baltimore, and has been an advisor for the Washington, D.C. LGBTQ Historic Context Study. So again, historic preservation and the role of history is an important theme that we'll be hearing a lot about today. Let me just finally, before turning it over to Dr. Roberts, add that Monica Rhodes, like Dr. Andrea Roberts, is a sixth-generation Texan. I found that on your bio online, Monica, and I know that about Dr. Roberts as well. So I think we couldn't have a better paired conversation with common intellectual interest and a common engagement with the history of Black freedom communities in Texas than with Dr. Roberts and Monica Rhodes. So without further ado, let me mention that we will have a lecture about 35 minutes from Dr. Roberts, and then she will open it out to a conversation that will be directed by Monica Rhodes. And then Eve, Blau, and myself will come back in to field questions from you, the audience. Please make sure you put them in the Q&A function in the chat. And so again, without further ado, let me turn it over to Dr. Andrea Roberts. We are so extraordinarily happy that you accepted our invitation to join us today for this memorial lecture.
Thank you so much, Diane. Thank you so much for having me today. Before I begin, I want to first acknowledge that I'm speaking today in College Station, Texas, which is situated on the land of multiple Native nations, past and present. I specifically acknowledge the Tonkawa, the Tawakoni, the Sana, and the Wichita peoples, and I pledge to support and advocate for the histories, cultures, languages, and territorial rights of historic Indigenous peoples of Texas and the Indigenous people that live here now. And I also want to acknowledge the migrant workers and the sharecroppers that originally worked this land that I now teach on. So I just wanted to begin with that. But I also want to root this talk in our historical moment. That is, I want to contextualize the work that I do within the overall sense that our country must reckon with its own narrative, its own core story. My work is very much about documenting how history, stories, narratives contribute to community resilience. I document African-American enactments of liberation through design, placemaking, and placekeeping, which reveals an adaptive repertoire of styles and innovations that shape their efforts to simultaneously refashion places and the self. So back to the reckoning. Narratives reinforce certain assumptions about national identity, as seen in John Gass's iconic picture here. You can see Columbia leaving the East, seeming to bring education and civilization to the West. And here we see one of the most blatant kind of notions of manifest destiny depicted in this painting. And this idea of westward expansion and manifest destiny, these narratives permeate throughout everything we do, especially in the built environment today. So my work problematizes these narratives. And narratives have also forced a reckoning with our thinking about public space and race. And narratives driving much of the confrontations that you see here in this slide just disrupted and informed the processes by which our society often makes decisions. So public spaces, monuments, monumental landscapes. We've seen how the Unite the Right rally, the Stop the Steal insurrection, these events in public space have catalyzed a new confrontation with history and a struggle with the history revealed to us through the 1619 Project, for example. We've had the death of George Floyd in 2020, which heightened our awareness and interest in addressing systemic racism. and especially systemic racism, not only in our streets, but in our classrooms and in our educational canon. And our infrastructure discussions remind the nation of the narratives which frame Black spaces as blighted, which then led to chronic disinvestment, destruction, and displacement. So preservation is a field in which these narratives meet the built environment. Professionals associated with this field help us determine which parts of our past we want to preserve for our future. And it helps us struggle with the systemic racism we find in the field when we contemplate that only 2% of the National Register of Historic Places, the 96,000 properties, represent African American heritage, 2%. And African Americans comprise less than 5% of licensed architects and engineers, less than 2% are preservationists. So one of the leaders of this movement to reverse these trends, Brent Leggs, explains that our reckoning of the past is to tell the full American history and foster truth, racial healing, and social justice. And so it is in the spirit that I contend with the role of the narrative as an instrument of heritage, conservation, and community resilience. And narratives have a number of spheres of influence with which I'm sure most of you are familiar. We have status narratives, we have resilience narratives, political discourse, and of course, historic preservation's regulatory language and complex. But today I'm most interested in the type of narratives that shape community building, planning, and preservation. And these narratives are in two categories that are interrelated. The core story of the individual, the stories we tell ourselves, that through this telling and retelling of the story, we are also reproducing ourselves and our behaviors, and the foundational story. And these are stories that are about the founding and the creation of places that have the power, especially in multi-ethnic and multicultural contexts, to address or have us confront those constructs or ideas or notions of what makes a place, what makes a nation. And Leonie Sandercock, of course, her concept of foundational story is resonating here in her work in Australia on settlerism and that narrative rooted in British identity. And so the overall story that I want to tell you about today includes my own core story and freedom colony stories, especially the stories that have shaped their work in their community cores or to invent new community cores, and the relationship between some of the claims I hope to make today and core stories. This picture depicts some of my core story. This is Riceville, Texas. This is my great-grandma. This is my grandmother, and that's my little sister. And that's me in the horrible sweater vest. This is my story. I was originally born in Sugar Land, Texas, which is a bedroom community of Houston with which many of you have come to be familiar with in recent years in light of the discovery of the Sugar Land 95. But it's also a place that was once a company town, and now it's a town or a space of master plan communities. And freedom colonies growing up and almost in the present are pretty absent from the local history. Instead, what dominates is an Anglo-settlerism narrative. This is another of my origin stories rooted in my career with the city of Houston, for example, in which I wrestled with the absence of place stories and histories from the ways in which we allocated funding through a community and development department when I was there, or from the way that it was very, very visible in the work of the Fourth Ward Redevelopment Authority, yet not effective in preserving the actual landscape that tells the story of that historic Black settlement. And below is my grandmother and her sisters in Independence Heights, another endangered place with which you're familiar because of the freeway construction threatening that community. But the dominant narratives that dominated my work and planning as a field can generally fit in some of these categories. That is, an emphasis on finding a one-size-fits-all solution, believing that all the work that we do must fall within blocks and corridors, that when we talk about history, we're only talking about memorialization of the past without bridging it to the future, and that everyone lives, if you're African American, especially in inner cities, and that the easiest and most expedient thing to do in the way of engagement is to locate either someone that you would in a derogatory way say is a token, but a gatekeeper who might be able to amass other consent and support. And so with freedom colonies, however, which I only came to an awareness of quite late in my life, and this shifted me away from my career at the city of Houston, actually into back to academia. And part of what led me to do this work was an inquiry not only into my own story and rootedness in several freedom colonies, but also being invited to learn more about settlements in Deep East Texas. But first I had to understand these places. And the way that we're taught to understand historic Black places is often that African Americans left plantations and they went straight to either sharecropping or straight to urban meccas like Houston. But in actuality, there were several settlements that were created between 1865 and 1930 that were either on the city's edge or in completely rural areas, known by many different names: Black towns, freedmen's towns, Black settlements. And so Juneteenth, that is June 19th, 1865, was a time of great celebration, but it was quickly followed by something called the Black Codes. This action by the Texas legislature was one of the earliest forms of backlash against African-American agency and self-sufficiency. That is, they were purposefully excluded from accessing land through the Texas Homestead Act. And consequently, they were able to amass an amazing amount of land. 2% of all farmland in Texas was owned by African Americans in 1870, but by 1900, 31% of all farmland in Texas was owned by African Americans. But this was what people often call bottomland, coastal, sometimes near former plantations or railways. And it's through intention and agency and the creation of institutions that anchored these places like churches and schools and clusters of landowners that they created these historic Black settlements. More than 557 of them at any one time existed in Texas. But what happened to these places? What people find hard to believe whenever I talk about this work is, how could we possibly have had this many places? Well, the reasons are myriad, of which many of you are familiar with: the impact of the Great Migration on rural areas, due in fact to the inability to often exercise the franchise and violence. They were forced to migrate in 4 different waves to different cities around the country. This led to population loss. This often made it easier for infrastructure projects to bifurcate these communities. You had, with that absence, the building integrity and demolition by neglect and deferred maintenance, lack of access to financing to improve homes and neighborhoods, and chronic disinvestment and annexation and zoning, which often meant that all you had remaining of both rural and urban freedom colonies is invisible and intangible heritage, that is memory. And so when Thad Sitton and James Conrad wrote the book Freedom Colonies, Independent Black Texans in the Time of Jim Crow in 2005, they described these places as dispersed communities, places unplatted, unincorporated, individually united only by church and school and residents' collective belief. I was, of course, enamored with the concept of collective belief and how such places were able to persist in the light of, as you see here, the concentrations of freedom colonies and their overlap with Hurricane Harvey disaster areas, Independence Heights fighting off a freeway. And this woman in Durgin, Texas, worried that she'll be displaced from her home due to the extraction in mineral rights challenges that so many African Americans in these places have, notably around land retention issues overall. And so there are three core issues that confront these places and threaten their survival: their visibility, their access, and their vulnerability. But it was when I encountered Shankleville, I was invited, frankly, to a festival, and someone said, this would be an interesting place for you to check out since you're interested in these places. And little did I know how much learning of their story and who they are would absolutely change my life, frankly. So in this community, Shankleville community, it is a place in which there are 50 households. What you see here is somewhat of their remaining core. There's a church here, and across there's one of two cemeteries that anchor the community. And in the distance, homestead, which I'll talk about later. But this community, this open field, this church, anchors a new celebration emerging that commemorates the lives of not only current residents, but also the founders of Shankleville, Jim and Winnie Shankle, one of the founding families. And according to the story of this place, Jim and Winnie Shankle were enslaved together in Mississippi, and they were separated when Winnie and her 3 children were sold to their owner, son-in-law in Texas in the mid-1840s. Determined to reunite with his wife and family, Jim embarked on a 400-mile journey to reunite with Winnie, and he hid in the woods until she heard a special whistle that only she knew. And she brought food from the plantation kitchen for him to survive, and he hid that food in the cold spring. And it is at this cold spring that every 2 years at a reunion, people commemorate through what we might call a libation ritual, or drinking of that water to commemorate Jim and Winnie Shankle, who remained here after emancipation and created this community. What you see here is one of the Shankle descendants who's standing next to that actual spring. And this is some inkling of an understanding of how the Purple Hull Pea Festival, which is when I originally visited what I saw, was a complete embrace of not only lifeways, but of a community that was committed to preserving its story. Laretha Clay, pictured here, is holding one of the many books in which she hand transcribed stories and oral histories of her relatives. And to give you an idea of the context in which we're talking about free Black communities in these celebratory narratives, it's in a region that's not necessarily known for those types of narratives, talking about Jasper and Newton counties that border Louisiana. And Shankleville is actually in Newton County. But Jasper, which is adjacent, is known more for the Jamesburg dragging death in Jasper County in 1998. I emphasize Jasper County because behind the pine curtain, people sort of assumed that Jasper, the city proper, was where this occurred, but it didn't. It actually occurred on Huff Creek Road, which is the home of Huff Creek Settlement. So buried within this story of this hate crime is the other layer of hate, of erasure of the Black community in which this actually occurred, or rather where his body was left. But what I found in Shankleville, attending annual events between 2014 and 2017, is the ways in which their diaspora of descendants were committed, fueled, and their lives shaped by that story, by that Jim and Winnie Shankle story. And people came as far as from New York City, descendants from Australia, descendants who are from Huff Creek, which I just mentioned, and Laretha Clay, one of the leaders of preservation of the community, who lives full-time in Dallas, but commutes to develop programming as well as rehabilitate structures in the landscape. And there's also adaptation, and that cultural adaptation happens very simply. Their homecomings occur in August, it's very hot. And if you're a young person, the last place you would likely want to be in the summer is in Deep East Texas. But what we see here during their scholarship competition and their talkback is a place in which young people are given their voice and an opportunity to take the story, internalize the story, and make it part of a speech, which then makes them eligible for scholarship funding. And they also hold open forums to talk about issues of the day and think of how Winnie and Jim Schenkel would have handled these issues and challenges. But it's also a space of cultural performance and the cultivation of social networks in which all of these individuals you see at the table represent a different freedom colony, not just Schenkelville, but they all attend each other's homecomings. And during the evening at these homecomings, they take up offerings that then finance maintenance of their cemeteries. So there's a very practical and celebratory reason here for their work. But I also want to bring some attention to a specific set of interventions in the landscape associated with other settlements in the area. Now, mind you, during the course of my work in Deep East Texas, while I spent some time, a lot of time in Schenkelville, I spent, and I continue to spend much time in a number of communities visiting with a number of descendants throughout the region. So I mentioned before the notion of the community core as being about core story. And we see that here with the Addie L. and A.T. Odom house, also known as the Odom Homestead, which is now listed on the National Register of Historic Places. The craftsman style home built in 1929 is not elaborate or special, except that it's very special to the community and to the descendants who have reverse engineered the found materials used to develop this home. You'll see at the bottom corner here, the historic preservation architect, Donna Carter, with a student who is performing a rehabilitation report in which she drew heavily on the memory and the stories of the place to determine the nature of what historic significance and integrity looks like and how that might be preserved here. But I want to talk about a very special place, Dixie Freedom Colony and its community core. I first learned about Dixie community actually being led on a community tour. I was led on a tour by two people. One is Herman Wright, who resides in Jasper County, as well as the late Gwen Blewett. And I say the late because in several of the pictures I will show you in just the time that I've been doing this work, I've lost several of these people. And it gives you a sense, and I hope it gives all of you a sense and an understanding of how urgent the recording of the stories and the practices really are. Because in this picture on the right, you also see the late Bobby Joe Hadnot. And what I've learned was about the power of the core story and the making of new core stories and how that changes the larger community. So Dixie Freedom Colony's foundational narratives, there are several. The most dominant one is promoted by Joshua Seal's descendants, William Seal and his family, who's pictured in the middle here, below the medallion on the wall. And William Seal was also the White House historian. And he is someone who actually promotes a narrative of Richard Seal, also known as Dick Seal, who was enslaved by his ancestors, but explained to be somewhat exceptional as someone who accompanied his master on business trips. And there's a whole construction of a narrative that's very much about white benevolence, coexistence. And what this is commemorating is the first church built by a formerly enslaved person in Texas, which was Richard Seal. But the story of the building and construction of the church was separated from the role of the church in the larger community. There are WPA interviews with two McRae brothers, and his descendants are actually part of all of the preservation and community core development that I mentioned earlier. And so with the Billy McRae narrative, what's emphasized often in that narrative is sort of the distortion of Black intention and agency that went along with so many of these narratives. That is, you had individuals who had been enslaved and understood interaction with white people to be dangerous. And so their narratives very much were often excessively differential for that reason. But there was a larger narrative that was associated with the memories of the gentleman that I just showed you. There's a narrative that's very much rooted in this historic school. The individual core stories of the people engaged in this work, in this preservation work, is around this historic African-American school known as the Carver School. However, in recent years, it was used for a number of different uses. That is, it was an American Legion Hall. It was a place in which bikers gathered. It was a space in which allegedly there was some racist activity. In other words, it wasn't a welcome space that anybody in the western half of the county liked. And then these men, the McCraes, the Hadnots, came together and purchased a place which at one time wouldn't even let them enter, even though they were veterans. They were not allowed to enter the American Legion group that met there. And so what we see with this institution is not an emphasis on the outside, but an emphasis on the inside. That is the rehabilitation of the gym floor, which held so many of their memories. But it's also a space in which they've generated funding by virtue of holding public events, even quinceañeras and reunions, and creating a new place for core activity in the community, which is completely rural and everyone is dispersed. But all of these individuals come together, the Hadnots and the McCraes, who often live most of the time in Houston, but come back to this community to celebrate their heritage and also to commemorate and revise another of their descendants, Bobby Seale, whose ancestors were married into the Seale family and the Traylor family in this area. And so the sense of community care, of organization, infuses their approach to adaptive reuse of the site. And in everything they do, they foreground Black stories and memories. And there's also a rewriting of the core story in the landscape in another way. With the loss of Bobby Joe Hadnot, we see in the cemetery a focus here on a new headstone. In the center of this headstone is Joshua Seale, the person who enslaved their ancestors. We see a shift here to the Hadnot, the memory of Bobby Joe Hadnot, a large stone that faces that one to offset its centering in the community. And so these are the stories and others of Never Sell the Land, Preservation as Resistance, that will populate my book in process. And so all of these show us the relationship between story and tangible outcomes. Foundational stories that hold memories and values, foster place attachment, and encourage participation, and catalyze real planning outcomes, reinvestment, cultural sustainability, recognition. And it also created this map and made visible these places. I engaged in all manner of ethnographic research and surveying that led me from believing that there were 14 settlements, that there were more than 36 in the area after walking tours and research and oral histories. I found that Freedom Colony descendants are somewhat rhizomatic. They come and go at different times for different reasons, but they are committed, even though living in diaspora as far away as Arlington, Texas, they are, of course, committed to the sustaining the cultural practices. And that there's a certain preservation apartheid. What you'll note with so many of these properties is not so much just an emphasis on how much the particular structure or materials are associated with one particular point in time to explain its significance. And that documentation comes in many forms, and that the standards upon which significance is articulated in these communities is much different than those dominating planning and historic preservation. And I also learned about what Freedom Colony descendants care about. And what you see listed here are several aspects of a Freedom Colony agenda. However, those that I, as a researcher, embrace were developing a centralized location for information, developing partnerships with institutions of higher learning, developing a learning community. And I also found that Black placemaking and keeping are an entirely different planning and design paradigm. And my understanding and interest in these places is somewhat rooted in African diaspora and archaeology, which says that, new African diaspora scholars are concerned with survivals and adaptation, but also are rightly concerned with vehicles for freedom and independence. Escape is one thing, but how did maroon and free communities rationalize or conceptualize freedom and institutionalize self-government? And that is what has given birth to the Texas Freedom Colonies Project, a statewide educational social justice initiative that engages in 3 core activities. We connect with descendants and collect their placemaking, keeping histories and stories. We countermap and secure that data, and we co-create applied research to address vulnerabilities. We do a lot of this work through our most public-facing work, which is our website, and specifically the Texas Freedom Colonies Atlas, developed in 2018 based on several years of collecting data about settlements. But it's comprised of actually 2 primary sources. One is the bundle of sources that we see as legitimate: census, state historical registries, National Register of Historic Places, but also the ephemera you see listed below, collected through electronic surveys, which then populate each point on this map. This was originally based on the work in the 2 counties, that is, the actual questions in the survey and the approaches. While one is electronic, it's still rooted in the same intention and focus. And so what we've been able to do is also show people who are sharing their stories the impact that they're making. And so here you'll see the public input and the input from researchers, and the blue signifies those that are fully verified. And we do a number of things. We're really committed to growing capacity through workshops, collaboration, our Adopt a County program, a YouTube channel, cemetery registry trainings, mentoring and project-based learning, and cultural resource management support. That is, we are part of the desktop review process for those engaged in Section 106 and other reviews. Before they even leave their desk, they look to our atlas to give some indication of which historic resources might be in harm's way. And of course, I mentioned the cemetery work we do, but I'd be remiss if I didn't note the National Trust for Historic Preservation's support for our development of the registry assessment and web portal strategic plan, as well as supporting the work of doctoral students like Jennifer Blanks, who has done a wonderful job in making a connection between environmental justice and historic sites. And there's several emerging projects. We're having a museum event. We do a lot of public-facing events with the intention of drawing people to some of the larger cities who have a connection with those dispersed areas. We have an Adopt a County partnership with Burleson County, in which we're supporting grassroots preservationists in a community called Dabney Hill. And we'll be leading Freedom Colonies Field School and an NEH Summer Institute at Dumbarton Oaks this summer, the People's Landscape History, and a Gulf Coast Heritage Preparedness Initiative, is a new research initiative. And here are the core claims as I conclude. That narratives matter. Core stories and place foundational stories are reflexive narratives that catalyze resilience, and that this reflexivity shapes preservation, adaptation, and resilience practices in these communities. Place matters. What we should learn in light of the Great Resignation, for example, is that workers are mobile and choosing a sense of place. They choose sense of place often over density and um, proximity to their work. And so they're likely to live in places, maybe even near freedom colonies that they would not have lived before. And that the people, the organic intellectuals, Gramsci would call them, are at the core of all of this work. And it should prompt us to fundamentally rethink the relationship between the core of the communities and the core stories that drive the people to preserve them. And finally, relationality and power matters. And we must change the way we educate and prepare planners, designers to enter and work with these communities using embracing a sense of cultural humility. And practitioners should learn from bottom-up revitalization, credit those engaged in this revitalization and this preservation work. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Roberts, for your amazing presentation. It's always a pleasure to see you and work alongside you in this work. So, and I'm sure we will certainly get conversations from the audience, but this moment, I'd like to dialogue with you about some of the questions that popped into my mind as you were sharing some of your work with Freedom Colonies. So much of what we do in heritage conservation world is about expanding historical understandings and leveraging heritage for making meaning in real time, right? So how do we use places? How do we activate these communities around this work? So in some ways, it's always a both and conversation. It's the writing and production, and it's the activism. So yes. I'm wondering, just from your perspective, how have you balanced both the scholarship, which then gets articulated with communities in your activism work? So can you speak a little bit more about how you've been able to do that?
I think it's extremely challenging. While I've had a supportive department, I will say that customarily the activist approach, or the engaged research approach to be more accurate, is one that requires time. And so the production associated with, let's say, qualitative or ethnographic field work often takes years. And to produce peer-reviewed literature based on that work can take even longer. And so a lot of what I've been doing is involving and mentoring my students through the process of developing their own agenda while working with me, and giving them a sense of their own identity. And that also gives them enough confidence to take on some of the work that I used to do alone. So I think the way that it works is if you grow more, essentially. If you keep thinking of yourself as the beginning and the end of all activism around historic Black settlements, for example, not only will you wear out, you won't be as effective as if you grew more. And so part of the balance for me has been really investing and pouring in to students as much as possible to be a part of the research team and do some of the work. The broader sense of or challenge is that as soon as you say activists in an academic space, people refer to your work as me-search. It's undermined. It's thought of as less legitimate. And I see your face, Monica. But it's true. And so several years of this work has been the activism of interrupting design and planning spaces with a sense that I'm not just telling the stories of these places to think about them as historical places of the past, but to fully interrupt and change and revise the way we think about what planning is today. And so that's the turn that I took in my scholarship. Rather than simply just exercising that fight. Personally, I made it the scholarship.
Yeah. Coming from the field of Black studies, it's kind of ingrained in the work. It's like you can't just sit in the ivory tower and produce. Like you have a responsibility to the community in which you're talking about to engage them in the work, and they're as much in conversation with you and the topic as you are with your colleagues, in academia. So yeah.
Yeah, but I mean, to be fair, I will say, 1969, Arnstein, you had this participatory turn, and you have this notion of citizen science in all these ways, and charrettes and all the ways that planners and preservationists and designers engage people. But relationship is different than extracting data.
Right.
And it takes an emotional labor, and it is a skill set, and we don't teach it.
Mm-hmm.
That's what I think is a large problem. We don't teach cultural humility, and we don't teach the building of relationship.
Yeah. And I also ask, even in the work that I do in with preservation communities across the country, with practitioners, there's just a lack of cultural competency that's there as well. Just kind of going into communities with a good faith efforts and expecting something that different, or trying to shift a dynamic that is deeply rooted in distrust, and for good reasons.
And for good reasons.
Fully acknowledged. Yeah.
Right. Yes, the distrust piece is huge. And, there is an actual definition, and cultural competency is a very real thing. But I often ask people to deconstruct that set of words. Competent in a culture. There's almost an arrogance in thinking that I can be competent in you. Mm-hmm. And while that's not the intention, there's a certain clinical way that we are conceptualizing what it is to be in relationship with other humans, especially with people who are fixated on the built environment. And so I really try to encourage people around a sense of humility and reflexivity. That is, knowing that going into an environment changes an environment. And if you're doing it right, that environment should change you.
Yeah, absolutely. It's certainly a relationship with the community, and the way that I think about preservation practice is it's about the future, right? So we are interrogating the past to understand the present, to collectively imagine a future that includes us all, and a field that honors all of our histories in their complexities. And so it's certainly both the work of the community and the practitioner to be in conversation together, and one can certainly not happen successfully without the other.
Right. Absolutely.
Yeah. And so that kind of brings me to another point that I heard in your conversation around like intangible heritage. So, internationally, like UNESCO and others have defined or practicing around creating protection around intangibility in ways that the United States hasn't necessarily caught up with how we designate according to like the National Register for Historic Places. And you bring up a fascinating point, and certainly accurate, about only 2% of sites listed on the National Register being connected to African American heritage. So just from your perspective, I'm thinking through what is that disconnect between this intangibility that the world seems to understand, that the United States is like particularly focused in on, does it have significance? What's its integrity, architectural integrity? And so you started to talk about that on one of your case studies. So just wanted to hear a little bit more about your thoughts around this issue that we have with privileging the built environment looking exactly one certain way, and significance being defined very narrowly along with architectural integrity.
I've seen this in a regulatory space. I served on the Austin Historic Land Commission. And very often there were people would come before us for permission to demolish another historic house. And you would hope to, especially for those in African-American settlements, see someone step forward for that house and what it means. And it's not that the community, I wouldn't say that they didn't care or they weren't invested in that house or wanted it demolished, but were they even aware that the mechanism through which they could make change was to lift their voices at the Austin Historic Landmark Commission one Monday a month?
Mhm.
You know, it's so much, there's so many barriers, and Stephanie Webster writes so well about the barriers to African Americans' engagement in historic preservation. And I think a lot of it is about, we've got to tear these walls down and validate what people bring to the table, validate and engage those who are already doing preservation work. So very often, I don't know if you've witnessed this, you'll have people who sort of witness or learn about a place or a space, and rather than them engaging people directly, 3 years later, they will have created a whole other initiative or a studio, and there's not a respect for the claim that was taken there. That was, the stake that people from there have. And so I think one of the things that's so important to me in this work is this acknowledgement, this validation. And not a validation that says you're as good as, but a validation that says, I respect you in what you bring to the table enough to engage you this way, not for how much you emulate my whiteness, but for how much you've been able to achieve regardless of available resources.
Absolutely. And the example that comes to mind from your presentation and was the homecomings that community members went to every year, put money into the collective pot of funds, this crowdsourcing to do this work and preserve these sites. And I often say, historic preservation in Black communities pre-pandemic happened every Sunday morning across the collection plate is passed. And it's oftentimes to go to the church fund, the building church fund, or that steeple, or to get these kids engaged or educate. Like, this crowdsourcing happens primarily without white people at the table in conversation with this is community preservation efforts that are happening and are often not acknowledged or put on the same level as these other activities, the regulatory activities that happen.
The regulatory activities, exactly. And just to circle back to your point about the intangible, it's not just about not having documentation and being able to show up in this regulatory space, but it's also some of our so-called experts who aren't pushing the envelope enough or doing all they can with the regulatory complex we have. Mm-hmm. And for example, there's a designation in which you can bring attention to traditional cultural properties, which often are ways to commemorate not only actual properties, but the significance of those properties are tied up in tradition, ritual. And more often than not, that is ascribed to or applied in Native American communities. But it can be applied in any community, including the sweetgrass communities in the Carolinas. It's been applied to a roadway there where women are making and selling those sweetgrass baskets. And so I think it's about really leveraging and using what we have in new innovative ways as well.
Absolutely. I agree. And there are not enough practitioners who are, to your point, well-versed in this space. I think we are starting to see a little bit more of in the field of these cultural districts. So in Baltimore, for example, there is a historic corridor where there are a number of theaters and are in various states of disrepair. But the city has one of the country's first cultural districts that acknowledges the activities that happened historically in that area. Again, kind of moving beyond these boxes of significance check and
exactly
that are available for protection.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So with that in mind, I want to just kind of go back to your discussion around theory and how you have approached your work and where your work is really rooted in. And there's a larger conversation around anti-racism in our public discourse. So is is your work connected, or how is your work in conversation with that particular theory that's on everyone's mind in this current moment of reckoning in our nation?
Well, I think it's significant that people can articulate anti-racist and it not be a controversy. Thanks in part, unfortunately, to the death of George Floyd, which, set off a whole cascading sense of social responsibility in some ways. I would say that our challenge now is anti-racist work belongs to white people. That is, to be anti-racist, to do the work of an anti-racist is to work through the power that you exercise in a space by virtue of identity. And that the work of African Americans and the ways that whites especially can be anti-racist is to create more space for liberatory Black work. And so the way I situate what I do is not about inclusion. It's not about just representativeness, though I'm fine and happy when that occurs. But it's about a fundamental redefining and centering of the African American, of the indigenous, of these forms of practice and these stories and these landscapes. It's very much for me about the centering without apology, without explanation that I'm about to do or engage in something anti-racist. It's the power to be. And I think as much as possible, we must create spaces for that as educators, as institutions, as preservationists, in whatever our capacity. And so I think the anti-racist work is laudable, wonderful, necessary, but it often requires a certain labor of people of color. And then often, just to differentiate, there's anti-Blackness, which we don't confront in our fields or even articulate sometimes.
Yeah. So
I situate my work as being about liberation, affirmation, attracting resources in need, right? This is not a Horatio Alger's, pull yourself up by your bootstraps, everything's okay. That's not what kind of party this is. What it is, though, is about centering this sensibility of what makes a place, about interrupting our notions of which places matter and why and deserve protection.
Absolutely, and well said. And I would also add to the fact that, that is exemplified in acknowledging the community efforts that are happening in preservation. So coming into a community, acknowledging that these activities have been going on for generations, and not necessarily thinking as practitioners, folks need to come in and save the day. It's acknowledging the liberatory activities that are happening and working in partnership with those to fund and amplify that great work that is already in happening.
Yes, and while it's wonderful to have this shared heritage, I do have a certain positionality because of the degrees, because of the professional past and whatnot. And so I do have to reflexively acknowledge that and going into communities. Some people assume, let's just send her. She's Black, they're Black, it'll work.
It works out.
But there's, of course, but there's more to it than that. We do have our own rootedness, but we also have life experiences that change the way we operate and move. And so we all have to be cognizant of, as you said, not coming in and thinking, I'm the savior and no one else has been doing anything, or nothing's been effective here until I get here.
Right. So one last question before I turn it over to Diane and Eve to run the Q&A portion of our conversation or the presentation. It's about Texas. So us both being deeply rooted in the state, understanding its historical past. I just want to get your take on how the state of Texas preservation community has responded to what you're doing with the freedom colonies. I mean, you pointed out correctly, like Mellon Foundation is putting millions into the preservation space. The National Trust through the African American Cultural Heritage Action Fund is funding into these places. So we're seeing funders and entities that were not necessarily centering this work 10 years ago. They're at the table now, and I'm wondering with the state of Texas, how are they responding to the work that you're leading in the state?
I think it's an interesting time. I think before Juneteenth became a national holiday versus post Juneteenth national holiday is a different world. And, capitalism takes hold, and you are suddenly have a gloss or a patina that can be, attained. Racial capitalism, right? It's so there's market forces in play now that we have become nationwide, right? But I think what's also happening is people ask me to come and speak, and it's an organizing tool. And what I mean by that is I would say I have pixie dust, but to sort of validate they're not alone and that there are hundreds of you. And yes, you're special, but you need each other. And so, a lot of how people are reacting we need you to come and say that we're part of that we're one of those. And so I've been in the business of expanding the ideas of what a historic settlement is rather than making it more narrow, which our marketplace, the way the world works, the way our profession, is all about what's rare, what's precious, which is important. But I think more and more people feel they have a right to the space, to the public space, to engage in preservation. So what's happening in Texas is the excitement about Juneteenth and new museum here or there. And then there's also this interest in cities of, okay, well, this gives us a sense of place where, people are interested in the iconography and remembering civil rights cases. Before, we were very quiet about our civil rights past, but now we're very excited about the Woolworth in San Antonio, for example, and not so much in other cities, but we're beginning to embrace more of that. And the thing I want to make clear is that Texas is a bellwether in the sense that we have the largest African-American population. When we think about African-American population, we think, New York or Eastern Seaboard or what have you, but we're 4 million people. We're more than 4 million people here. We're millions. And so this is the place where, if we're going to tell the story, the complex story that is of America, all the way back to Esteban in 1528, we've been here a long time. And so when we think about Texas, we've got to rethink our entire story, our entire narrative. And so I think there's a growing consciousness of all of that because of the light, shown on us. And a lot more people seeing the power of preservation and of monumental spaces to catalyze actions, to bring attention to issues. So there's more and more kind of change in monumental spaces as well in Texas beginning.
Well, I'm certainly hopeful for a brighter future around how Texas engages with its past and what it puts in its textbooks.
Yes.
As goes Texas education system, so does the nation. So I think we are all watching closely with how Texas is responding in this particular moment with how they're talking about the importance of everyone understanding what American history is about. So, you want to respond? Go ahead.
I'm agreeing with you.
So, and I will bring Diane and Eve back on to moderate our Q&A portion. Thank you so much, Andrea, for the discussion.
Thank you.
Thank you both. Andrea, in particular, that was an amazing talk, so rich. And the activities that you're doing and the range of what you're doing is fantastic. And Monica, it was great the way you pulled out a number of these issues that kind of came up and questions that are on everybody's mind. And so I'd like to start off with some of the questions that we have received here, that there are a lot of questions about how you do what you do and what the process is, and how can that, how can other people sort of try to do what you're doing in some way or another. And so one of the questions that we have here is a question about somebody who asks, who's interested in the potential of the atlas, for instance, which I think is a fascinating thing, and the website that you have that is really participatory beyond your own sort of sphere of activity in the university and in publishing and so forth. So the question is the potential of the atlas, and how can it, as a counter map and counter archive, those concepts are interesting, intervene in the preservation apartheid that you've identified in your own research. And I wondered if you might address that.
Yes, I think it's about actually locating several historic resources, cultural resources, that's building structures, object, places, landscapes, that would not have previously been located or identified. So that's one piece. And that's why everything can't be left up to the atlas, and also has to be accompanied by training. We work with county historical commissions that in Texas are not very diverse, to put it lightly. And so very often, heritage activities are happening on the local level in rural areas through these mechanisms, through these commissions. And so if they're not educated, they often say, come on over and show me the atlas so I can use it for surveying. But what has to come with that is an understanding of what it is you're looking for. So there's a whole perspective and approach we use called critical place studies, in which we understand a landscape or a place to be legitimate through several different lenses and forms of information, right? And so there's the literal, I'm interviewing you, I'm getting information, but there's a whole tab on the atlas that's called visual history. And what you're looking at is, are people uploading images of places that either once existed or that exist now, and say, this place needs help. And while we're not necessarily equipped to do it ourselves, we do have a Center for Heritage Conservation, and they've worked with some of our settlements like Dabney Hill, for example. We are really in the business of trying to connect people to the resources, right? But the atlas and its potential, I often hear this and I think to myself, first, I developed the atlas with its intention of not only being applicable in this context, but to be applicable in several other marginalized contexts. So the idea of doing more with it is exactly what I intend. I've spoken with people in unrecognized tribes, to be specific. And it takes so long for them to get through processes and amass information. And their descendant communities are often scattered all over the place if they're not living in place. And so some people have discussed with me, how do we use this atlas to make ourselves strategically visible? And so what I invite folks to do is to look at not only literature, but also partner with us and have us engage in training and have us collaborate on, I don't know, research and grants, so that we can, what we're doing with the atlas is we started, just to give you perspective, 2017 to 2019, experimenting with the actual platform and development. And then 2019 to 2020, really looking at new ways to actually engage folks and deal with user experience. At the same time that we're amassing information, we're slowly moving into the audit phase, the legitimacy phase. Like, okay, we're getting a lot, but what's really in here? And so we're in that phase. next? And then the phase after that is using that data for research, and also helping to ethically propagate the model we've developed in not only historic settlements in Texas, but around the country and the world, and not just Black communities either. I'm very interested in working with Indigenous communities.
Fantastic. So, I mean, that was one of the questions that I was thinking about, you know, where you're going to take that website, which is so important and has so much potential, actually. But there's another question that's along similar lines here about how do you tell stories about these communities of the past, and that you talked about creating a one-size-fits-all approach, creating strategies that can be implemented in multiple communities. And this is from someone who is a teacher, actually, and who knows that her students would love to hear about this because they're interested in becoming involved in other communities and in other parts of the country too.
Yes. So I can say this about the one size fits all piece is that the face-to-face engagement we do safely with mass is now allowing us to do what I started with, which is more actual face-to-face work, working with the Atlas, but also every community, for example, has a different definition of what a settlement is. So it's about being responsive and malleable. We've been doing work in Brenham, Texas, and that's somewhat in central Texas, about an hour and a half from, or hour or so from Houston, and working with a group of African-American descendants there. And they're explaining to us, well, they're not called settlements, they're now called additions. And, you know, that's not something we knew, because when we're in planning and we think of an addition is a very specific characterization of a place. But then you find this is how the word is applied, and these are the landscapes they're applied to. And so it requires a certain inquisitiveness that's not just about filling out the form, but asking the right questions as well, and not being dismissive and say, oh, well, that's not a freedom colony. That's not what this says. So bye, I'm not interested, right? So I think a lot of this is you learn as you go. So there wasn't a platform that came out of a box and it worked, and then we just went. It's been an iterative process. I started working on it with a GIS student who was a master's student in 2017, who's now gone on to work for the organization that helped develop the platform. And so it's ever changing. So it may look this way now, but because of the strategic plan we just completed, we're now looking at not just more bells and whistles, but better user experience, a real deep exploration of the ethics that we hope to espouse by doing this work. And some of that is security and moderation and all these types of pieces that, don't worry, yes, I've thought of it, but I'm a full-time professor. And
right.
Students come
it's
and
your
go.
day job, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Right. Diane, did you want to pick up on one of the questions?
I would like to throw in a question. There are a lot of great questions in the Q&A. I hate to use my position here, but it's just such an amazing presentation. And the work itself, Andrea, is like so inspiring, and it comes through in the questions and answers. I guess I wanted to ask a question that might be slightly different than what some of the others are focusing on. And that is moving a little beyond the kind of thinking about the planning and the design dimensions and the digital humanities and its role, the platform and its role for education. That's all there, and that's great. But I wanted to pick up a little bit on that last exchange between you and Monica and think about the state of Texas more generally. I teach classes in urban governance, and I'm thinking about regions and governance at multiple scales. And a lot of your work focuses on the communities and the great placemaking or placekeeping efforts and the cultural competence and the humility, which is so important. But I'm wondering, how do we explain the fact that few of us in the United States know about this? This is an important part of the Texas history. We don't think about this type of, when I think about Texas, I have my own political understanding of its position right now. But in your work, your website mentions there were 557 of these colonies established over a long period of time. Why do they not have, I mean, maybe you're doing this, but why, is there a way that they can change Texas politics more generally, like networks between them? I guess I want to think a little bit about the larger territorial scale of Texas and what possibilities you see for this movement, a network movement across the landscape, to change politics in a place that really needs to confront the fact that, as you said, it has 4 million, the largest African-American population in our country. And why is it that that is not kind of leading the state?
So I think that's changing, but I think part of it is there's much more attention to the influx of people and why they come to Texas. So for example, the migration of people from California, for example, or the migration of people from other depressed areas to Texas, and the climate for business. And that's the public narrative and public story, because that's what's of paramount concern to the leadership we have. It has been for some time. And so it's only, recently that we've gone beyond the settlerism narrative, right? Because that had a certain utility to it. But the story that has the most utility at this time is really that of, we're open for business, come here for business, business, business. I think that you were asking about the notion of a network and strengthening and using Texas Freedom Colonies Project as a mechanism for organizing. I would say this. I think that an endowed, research infusion of investment in an endowment type form would enable us to really do the state scale work that I intend. So there's that. And that's in the way of capacity and being visible and available in certain spaces to work with communities in 250, well, at least, 2/3 of our 254 counties. So there's that. But what I really see is this focus on what we call the triangle. And again, part of that's commerce, but part of that is, these are the major cities. This is where the votes are. And so if you are doing preservation work and you're doing it in Dallas, or you're doing it in particular parts of Houston, or doing it in particular parts of San Antonio, where you know that this investment in supporting whoever this constituency is in this particular area is going to catalyze more people coming out to vote, then that's kind of why you see such a concentration of work on preservation in certain places. It is a lot more difficult when we're talking about these very dispersed areas, because our counties have no planning power. So if we had a different political infrastructure in which counties engaged in planning, local areas and cities were not as afraid of historic preservation ordinances. These are the things we need that could really change people's connection and ability to move in the public square in new ways. What helps with Freedom Colonies is that the people that I work with or partner with, a majority of them are between the ages of, let's say, 35 and 75. And they're mostly able to work with the internet. And they're people who are very much about this liminality of living in both worlds. And so to do a lot of the political work you're talking about, we got to move away from, here's the dots concentrating the Black folks on the map, and this must be where they are. And if I just get to them all there, I'll be fine, to this much more complicated set of multiplicities in our identities and sense of place and connectedness, and capitalize on that. And that's my purpose, frankly, at Texas Freedom Colonies Project, is to show that our footprint is not only on the history, our footprint is right now over large stretches of the state, rural and urban, because we have our foot in two spaces, sometimes three, right?
That's amazing. What a wonderful answer. I love the way you think about the potential across the territory. And I'm wishing you all the best luck, and hopefully we can all support you. Eve, I'll turn it over to you to kind of,
Right. I have sort of one last question for you that I think is of particular interest to people here at the GSD. And that is that it seems to me that this project that, looks at places that, once were material and inhabited and lived places, and are in many cases no longer that, but that can still be mapped. And mapping is a really interesting thing in terms of making something visible and also making it territorial. Giving it a kind of political resonance, actually. And I think that in a way it reconceptualizes preservation, and it makes preservation itself, I mean, I'm sure preservation is conceived of that in that way anyhow, but as a generative process, as an act of generating, and of showing placekeeping actually to be really creative. And that what's going on here, and I sort of want you to respond to this a little bit in the next couple of minutes that we have, is that you're creating not only community, but what is really interesting is a commons, I think, that it's a process of creating a commons, a kind of shared resource.
Well, it's a virtual world of Black worlds, is what
yes, exactly. And that this kind of space has disappeared from, cities and urban spaces. And I guess that I want, this final question is, is there an effective role for design and planning in this? And this kind of dynamic, embodied narrative understanding of place, can that inform design and planning? So a final question for you about that.
I don't think there's nearly enough scholarship on adaptive reuse. There's case studies, there's practice stories sometimes, but I think for design, you should really think about how the intervention in these spaces should not only uphold these notions. It means learning about historic preservation, learning the regulatory complex, that it's not all about Victorian houses, and that it's not all just fetishizing buildings, that it happens on several scales. So the place for design is to grow its aptitude, its understanding of historic preservation, so that it can serve what I call place preservation, which is what I'm most interested in. And that's it's leveraging historic preservation, but it's place preservation is what I'm most interested in. So yeah. I think that's where design needs to be going, is supporting sense of place and supporting adaptive reuse projects, which can create new uses and centers and for so many of the historic structures. And we just need a cooperating Secretary of the Interior, which I think we're having now, and head of the National Park Service, who will begin to see ways we can bridge adaptive reuse and his historic significance and integrity and have them come together. So that's what I'm looking to push for and to change.
Terrific. It looks like we have run out of time, but I think that you have created a new kind of common space for us all to come together and to understand this as a shared resource, actually. Not only shared stories, but a shared resource.
Yes.
And I want to thank you very, very much for this wonderful presentation and the wonderful discussion with Monica as well. And for the people who have sent in terrific questions, and we are going to share the list, actually, of questions, including those that we didn't get to. There are a number of them that are really important. We just ran out of time, as we always do. And that's one of the important things about this process, that the conversation goes on. And so we look forward to that in many ways. And thank you very, very much.
Thank you, everybody. Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you.